Thank you to the curators for your talk just now. I feel like it's very much a generous invitation to be in conversation, and I hope that there is time for dialogue. So the title of my keynote this evening is South by East Axis, Race, Art, Geology. And yeah, it's just an honor to be here. I work just a block away at Hunter College, where, as Carla mentioned, I'm an associate professor. So I work in the Department of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies. And it's there that I teach on the importance of Caribbean theory and thought, and have been doing this work, for over a decade. So it's wonderful to have company, to have fellow travelers and thinkers around this question of haunting, of empire. And my keynote will focus on the questions of colonialism and diaspora, and the kinds of strategies and formal choices that we see artists of Asian descent using, and the kind of curatorial logics that are offered through this show as an opportunity. So when I wrote my dissertation at Yale on this topic of Afro-Asian intimacies, one of the comments was, it's unclear if Ms. Goffe intends to bury or to resurrect the Chinese ghost. And I felt like the answer was both. So it's wonderful to be in conversation with curators who see this question not as a binary, but one of mourning, which was mentioned, one possibly of melancholia. And I guess I offer 4 sections of analysis, and I just want to give you the overview so you can get a map of where we're going tonight. So I begin with this introduction, where we take Columbus to task and his mistake in 1492. So each section will be about 10 minutes or so, just to give you a sense of where we're going. Second, I'll be looking at the question of the Caribbean as method, which is to say that I'm in conversation with Kwan Sing Chen and his notion of Asia as method, and to think about what that offers us. And then third, I'm very interested to think through what the curators are offering us as far as Latin America's geometries, and how this really challenges the kind of triangulation that we see in the United States. To conclude, we'll look at Zheng He and his detour to the Americas, and this idea that he may have arrived here, the Chinese admiral, in 1421, and how that really disturbs this notion of what it means to be the first, what it means to discover. So to begin with, Columbus's mistake is one that shows us the kind of economies of maybe a curatorial mindset or logic of scarcity, which is one of discovery, which is one that we're called to think of every October, because it is said that on October 12th in 1492, he arrived in America. But what we know is that he arrived in Guanahani, which is the present-day Bahamas, and sailing as an Italian explorer for the Spanish crown, we ought to think about what was inaugurated and enacted in terms of the currents of racial capitalism, and the ways in which we are still paying for that mistake that he made by sailing south to the quote-unquote Indies. So a thinker that has deeply influenced my writing is Stuart Hall, who really is a founding father in terms of Black British political thought and cultural studies. And he said in 1990, when you visit Guyana or Trinidad, you see symbolically inscribed in the faces of their peoples the paradoxical truth of Christopher Columbus's mistake. You can find Asia by sailing west if you know where to look. So Stuart Hall is also of Asian ancestry. So when he made this comment as someone from Jamaica, he was pointing to all of the various colonial intimacies that are a matter of genealogy for people of African and Asian descent in that country and elsewhere across the hemisphere. So this is, I guess, a question that comes up for me in the book that I'm writing that's coming out next year called Black Capital, Chinese Debt. And it's one that, I guess, answers the question that is often asked of me, as far as what does it mean to be Jamaican Chinese? People would often say, which part of you is Jamaican Chinese? And it's an answer that can be best answered through the writing of this book and through the painful and mutilated history of debt economies, of British imperialisms that brought a social economic experience together in order to sustain the sugar economy after the abolition of racial slavery. So Chinese laborers were imagined as a solution and were imported as a barrier race between the black majority and white minority in Jamaica, which is where my mother is from. But there's almost 200 years of history and presence of the Chinese in Jamaica. So the question of the appearance of the Asian subject in the Caribbean and Latin America is one that forces us to look at different timelines. And if we look to Asian notions of temporality, we might find nonlinear strategies, which I would argue that the various artists that we look at in the show offer us as well. People often wonder, what is a black woman doing up here speaking about Asian art? And it's interesting that a white man would not necessarily be questioned when we consider area studies and the kind of Orientalism of that field of study. So I've been told at my previous job where I worked at Cornell University, Tao, you are illegible. And I always question legible to whom? So as a retort, I would say that in the Caribbean, what is legible as Asian or black in terms of race is a far more complicated question than the kind of binaries that we see in the United States. And it's quite incredible that the curators are giving us a way to problematize what Asia means. Is Asia a race? How do we fit under this umbrella? The question of India, Columbus's mistake of the Indies, the question of Japanese empire in Brazil and the Americas, the fact that Columbus thought he was arriving in Cathay, China, when he set sail, as well under this umbrella, which was really heartening to see. We have artists from Indonesia, so Southeast Asia, the East Indies, Java, and also North Korea and South Korea. So it's really incredible what the curators have done to bring all of these Asian identities under one umbrella. The way that I choose to approach these questions is also in a dialogic manner, and I think it's really wonderful. You should watch the video, if you haven't, on YouTube of the curators talking about what it means to have these artworks in conversation. But the way that I choose to create this dialogue is in a layered manner, and this is the question of geology that has really preoccupied my research in terms of art history over the past, I guess, 4 years or so. So I turn to this notion of racial sedimentation, which is a way of understanding the history of guano in the 19th century and Chinese laborers in Peru who were forced to take their own lives in what is, again, a mutilated history in which they were tricked, in many cases, in coming to Peru to labor and to mine guano. So this is a climate history, this is a labor history. It's a brutal history through which many Chinese men died, and it seems to be one that is forgotten cyclically. So in excavating this history, we begin to see that the question of Asia in the Americas is actually not just one of race and racialization, but also of biomatter. It's a question of burial, it's a question of materiality, it's a question of ecology, and those who died and actually became part of the hemisphere. So I argue that within this bedrock of the hemisphere, there are these sedimented layers, and race becomes this kind of process, a kind of metamorphosis of becoming part of the hemisphere, and this is the claim that Asians are able to make on top of the foundation of indigenous presence and survivance, as well as the layer of African racial slavery. So then on top of that layer, we have the presence of Asians brought as replacement laborers for enslaved African labor. Added to that, there are Middle Eastern histories. There are many layers to the hemisphere. And to look at this question geologically offers us a different kind of timeline. So I see these themes represented in the show, and it's exciting to think about sediment and the ways that organic material is used as a strategy by many of the different artists. So to Columbus is a verb, right? And this is something that I take on in the periodization of my book that's forthcoming, Dark Laboratory, which Carla mentioned. So I think we should hang on to what Stuart Hall said about Columbus, and again, to what it meant for him to make this mistake, sailing south to the Indies, and how it is that we are still paying for the price of that fallacy. Another, I guess, important or influential text that I would mention is The Intimacies of Four Continents by Professor Lisa Lowe, who teaches at Yale, and she really gives us a way of understanding the political economy of these questions of the 19th century. And again, this kind of elision of this history and the cycle of forgetting Afro-Asian intimacies. So curatorially, these questions have been asked. I guess the show was in, I believe, 2018, Circles and Circuits, Chinese Caribbean Art, and there was a part 1 and part 2, which was a collaboration on the West Coast between Stephen Wong and Alex Chang, and there's also a smaller show in 2022 at the Ford Foundation Gallery, curated by Andil Gosin, of 4 artists representing the genealogy of racial indenture, so the debt economy that arose out of Asians being brought to labor on plantations in the Caribbean. But I think this show does something different, which really is an opportunity to think against the logic of scarcity and actually to think about abundance. So the questions that I feel this show poses, and hopefully we can discuss this, are: what does it mean for us to be situated here on Park Avenue? What does it say of diplomacy and diplomatic relations between Asia and the Americas? And yeah, how do we define Asia? So do we see Asia as a continent in terms of the intimacies of continents? Is Asia a race? Is Asia simply a geography? Do we include Russia within this definition? Third, how do we define the Americas? This institution answers that question, and I think the S at the end of Americas is pregnant with a lot of meaning when we consider the way that the United States takes up so much oxygen in every conversation, when this notion of America as a continent has always included the Caribbean and Latin America. But the S does a lot of work that we can work through. So my question was, is this the first occasion that these 3 institutions have collaborated? So that being Asia Society, Asia Art Archive in America, and America's Society. And it's great to know that I guess there was an earlier moment at which, I guess a decade ago, Asia Society was in conversation and collaboration with America's Society. So I think more of these collaborations allow us to broaden and to be inclusive as far as the resources and the funding that are required to actually put on a show of such scale and magnitude. So if we shift now to the Caribbean as method, I would introduce the work of Kamau Brathwaite, the Bayesian poet, and the ways in which he pushed us to look vertically instead of horizontally as far as an axis of analysis. So he famously said in one of his poems, "The unity is submarine." And this is the ways in which I have taken geology as a mode of analysis for how we might look geographically. So once we look along this y-axis, we begin to see that there are different shifting tectonic plates which form different boundary points and racial fault lines. So just as Kwan-Sing Chen used Asia as method to critique the motives of imperial histories, both of Japan and the United States, we can look to how the Caribbean becomes, through the archipelago or the island, a way to critique colonial narratives. And we can also raise the question of diaspora, because it is not always as innocuous as it might seem. So Wilfredo Lam really is the cornerstone of this interrogation as I see it, and his painting downstairs is really incredible in how it sets the stage in a foundational and geologic way, and for those who are able to understand his heritage and understand the African poetry that lives within all of his different works, there's a kind of encoded sense of Cuba and its bedrock in terms of the sugarcane that we see here in La Jungla, which is in the MoMA collection. But there's also the question of what is legible in Cuba as Chinese or not, because even though his last name is Lam, many people were not necessarily aware that he was of Chinese ancestry. So he was often spoken about as being the Black Picasso, and his response to that shows us the kind of strategies that he and other artists modeled in terms of how they were read versus the kind of work that they were doing. So he said, "I believe my paintings reflect our life, our complexes, and the idiosyncrasies of our people, our climate and geography, with their beauty and violence, the cacophony which characterizes our common condition." So Lam said this in 1954, and just a year later, he paints Here on Earth, which is downstairs. And yeah, there's much to contend with in terms of the kind of temporalities which come from Chinese cosmologies, as Yuji was mentioning earlier, and also from Santeria, which is part of the, dreamscape that he shows us with these various figures. So Here on Earth downstairs, painted in 1955, really made me think about this painting that I write about, Rumor de la Tierra, and the ways in which Lowry Stokes Sims has analyzed both paintings in terms of the symbology of beauty and violence. Many saw this painting, Earthquake, or Rumor de la Tierra, as a kind of maybe Cuban version or Black version of Guernica. But there's so much more that is taking place here. So painted in 1950, we can see that he's very much in conversation with Aimé Césaire, and it's not often that you'll see Notebook of Return to My Native Land, the famous text by Césaire, without the artwork of Wilfredo Lam, because he was that integral to the Negritude movement. Such was the case, along with Suzanne Césaire, that they actually collaborated under the title of Lamière, and it just shows us this question of Asia as being integral to this understanding of islandness, to the understanding of the archipelago, from Martinique, where Césaire was from, to Cuba, and this common language of African poetry. So in this painting, I interpret a kind of birth of the wretched of the earth. We see these splayed figures, and we can interpret the earth tones that are here as part of a language and critique that that Lamb is giving of colonialism. So as much as Picasso was critiquing fascism in Guernica, Lamb critiques the fascism of colonialism in conversation with Aimé Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism in 1950. So an interviewer famously said to Lamb, "Picasso was your discoverer, your artistic godfather. They also say that your style came from Picasso's paintings." Lamb responded, "I was not influenced by Picasso. What happened is that with Picasso was that black art influenced visual arts from Europe for the first time. I'm very much indebted to Picasso for all the support he gave me, and I will always be grateful to him for this. Picasso was a fantastic guy. Once, although he had evidently not even had a glass of wine to drink, he started screaming in the middle of a reception that he was the real inventor of photography." So, to Columbus is a verb. And though they were friends, Picasso shows, perhaps as a Spaniard, the way in which he could even convince himself that he would be the one to teach Picasso about his, or to teach Lamb about his African ancestry. So Lamb identifies this circular logic as being someone himself of African descent, and that these articulations of primitivism would actually be ones that emanate from the archipelago, from Cuba itself, and the ways in which Chinese cosmology is also embedded within Santeria, which is known to some, but not to the uninitiated. So it's fascinating then that we see in Here on Earth these earth tones, as well as symbols of the Freemasons, organization that he was a part of. The bird represents a nightmare that he had, but also bats that are indigenous to Cuba. And here we can see the island, so Cuba as an island, as part of this Caribbean as method of destabilizing this idea of the continent and the mainland. So where Césaire gives us the notebook of return to the native land, again engaging with this question of landedness, Kelly Sinapa Mary from Guadeloupe and the French Caribbean experience gives us a notebook of no return. So her inclusion within the show downstairs is really fascinating when we think about this question of diaspora and the matter of the impossibility of return in relation to negritude and what it means for her to be producing this art from Guadeloupe, especially as Guadeloupe is not sovereign. It continues to be a part of France territorially. So there's a lot at stake when we think about the theory that's coming from this island space, as well as from Martinique. And again, how it destabilizes the continental vision, but it's also this space of occupations. Maria Magdalena Campos Pons gives us the ancestralist ceremonial. So we can see the ways in which, again, artists of Asian descent are using these different strategies, formal choices of representing this question of the ghost, the apparition that is buried and not buried. In this Polaroid installation, Finding Balance, we see the kind of ornate adornment of what it means to wear these Orientalisms and to contend with these histories within Cuba. Within the art of Andrea Chung, we see a real challenging in terms of these formal choices as far as historiography, again, with the island as a way of questioning these histories. So Chung went to Mauritius, another island space, which also disrupts this question of the great experiment that European nations were hoping to save the sugar industry with in the 19th century. And there's a kind of disappearance that takes place here that I feel is in conversation with the appearance that the curators of this show give us. So these boats that are made of sugar eventually disappear, and it speaks to the materiality of the plantation. And I've written about this as a kind of sugar work and a critique that we see, again, as a strategy from various artists. In this work, The House of the Historians, we also see a challenging and interrogation of who writes histories, imperial histories, with this nest made by weaver birds that Chung is showing us, made of sugarcane, and the ways in which there's a conversation here as to who writes history, and a kind of communal sense of building a house for that history. Another artist that we might think about in conversation and the dialogue of the Caribbean as method and islands is Jody Lin Ki Chow, a performance artist who shows us these ephemeral circuits of performance. And in her her 2014 performance, Wo Shi Yi Jie Zi Sun, which translates to I am a descendant, in Guangzhou in 2014, we get a sense of this kind of dialogue that's taking place between port cities. Richard Fung, who is from Trinidad and Tobago, also enters these conversations by querying the question of inheritance and, again, this impossibility of return. So, yeah, I highly recommend, if you would like to learn more about these kinds of circuits, to watch My Mother's Place and Nang by Nang, in which, for decades as an LGBT rights activist and filmmaker, he's been challenging, I guess, these notions of authenticity through the lens of diaspora. So what I feel is really exciting about this show is that Latin America enters the conversation, making it really the first to bring together the geography of Latin America and the Caribbean, which should make us question, I guess, how it is that these two areas are positioned together. Is it out of the kinds of departmentalizations of area studies? I've often, I guess, thought about the funding of area studies and the kind of holdover of the Cold War that kind of positions us together, where funding for Cuban studies and, for instance, studies on Mexico gets the most amount of funding and space, but there is a lot to contend with in terms of whether Latin America and the Caribbean have much of anything to say to one another. But in this show, there really is a dialogue that is set into place. In departments where I have worked, it's been the kind of division between, I guess, a white Latin American history and Hispanophone history, and then a black Anglophone history to do with the Caribbean. So the ways in which this show answers those questions is important to the sense of geometry that is offered that really is beyond triangulation. So Claire Jean Kim, a Korean-American political scientist, gave us this notion of racial triangulation in order to describe the contestation of the LA riots and uprisings. But I think what is very powerful about this show is that it shows us that there is a geometry of relation beyond triangulation that exists in Latin America, and there are many geometries that we ought to be taking into account. So art historian Joan Key, who is the new director of the Institute of Fine Arts, just blocks away from here at NYU, has a wonderful book called The Geometries of Afro-Asia, Art Beyond Solidarity. And I think the ways in which she shows us this relationality, following in the sense of Edward Glissant, is very exciting because it goes beyond the binary, it goes beyond the triangle. And if we look to the geometry of Lydia Okamura's The Appearance, as the curators just told us, there is a kind of dimensionality that's being played with in terms of the optics of what we're seeing here from this 1975 silk screen. So yes, it's very exciting to think about what nodes might be missing from the triangulation between black and white with Asian as a wedge. Claire Jean Kim herself, actually has renounced her, I guess, theory of triangulation to say that it's actually more complex than that in her latest writings. And I feel that what's missing is the note of indigeneity. So Cecile Chung, whose work is represented downstairs of her blooming wawas, shows this strategy of formal choices again through compost and the ecologies that we see downstairs. So included in this sculpture is tree bark, clay, all of these organic materials, and caustic, so wax, come together to create the guagua, which is a Quechua word for the swaddled baby. And Cecile told me a beautiful story about growing up in Quito and seeing these swaddled babies. And it really just made me think about the indigenous future and this question of indigeneity, which often gets completely erased from the US context of analysis. So I did my PhD in American Studies, and I was always pushing for the emphasis of the S at the end of Americas in order to understand the hemisphere, and often missing, which creates another kind of epistemic erasure, is the genocide of Native peoples, but the ways in which that was assumed to be true is something that really is being taken to task in academia today. So the myth of, I guess, genocide regarding Native dispossession of sovereignty in countries like Ecuador, where Cecile Chung is from, also in Brazil, where Daniel Leigh is from, shows us that there's another node that is missing, which is that of Native survivance. So as much as there's blackness and the question of racial slavery, whiteness from Europe, we have to contend with the foundational layer of, millennia in terms of Native sovereignty and survivance across the hemisphere. So Daniel Leigh offers us these ritual technologies in many of their works of art, and the one represented downstairs is really wonderful in that it plays with the digital, as Yuji Raphael had said. But it also makes me think of El Paquete in Cuba, and just the kinds of rituals, again, the kinds of cosmologies, the ceremonial as strategy. So I think it's really wonderful because Indonesia so often gets left out of these conversations. So South Asia, Southeast Asia become part of this necessary conversation. And Daniel Leigh, being Indonesian, and Pernambucano, born in Sao Paulo, is so important to their artistic practice, being based in Berlin. So in some of the larger scale works of theirs, which have featured fountains and mushrooms, there's a kind of ceremonial and geologic sense of soil and rootedness, and again, this kind of sediment and layer of what it means to be in and of the hemisphere. So I conclude with Zheng He and his detour. In 1421, it is speculated that he may have arrived here, so to the Western Hemisphere, and as is suggested by the curators in the curatorial text, though we see the labor movement and migration in the 19th century of Asians in Latin America through the currents of racial indenture, plantation labor en masse, there has always been Asian presence in the hemisphere. So what does it mean to think about 1421 and this Chinese admiral who was not even exactly Chinese? What does it mean to be Chinese? What does it mean to be legible as Chinese? He was Muslim and was known as Ma He before he became Zheng He, and he was a eunuch. So there's much to contend with as far as what empire meant to the Chinese in the early 15th century and what it meant for him to be this storied admiral, what it meant for him to have traveled to East Africa, to have traveled with this fleet, to think about Chinese technologies, naval technologies, and the question of the timeline of how this is represented is so, I guess, what's the word? In opposition to the model and the mindset that we see regarding Christopher Columbus and this notion that he was the first. So it seems not to be important to China to say that Zheng He was the first, and it represents a different sense of empire or encounter that we ought to think of as a kind of curatorial logic. Because considering these histories, there ought to be a kind of abundance and interrogation. So another book that I would recommend is Mandarin Brazil, Race, Representation, and Memory by Ana Paulina Lee, who's associate professor at Columbia University. And she takes up the circuits of the ways in which Chinese were excluded and Japanese were welcomed in Brazil. Again, as part of what Chie mentioned, this national project of mestizaje, of nation building, and of erasure. So as much as diaspora is a question of the past, it's a question of the future as well, and this kind of cycle of forgetting. Another book that really speaks to this question in the Mexican context is Chino by Jason Chang, who teaches at University of Connecticut. So we can see in this anti-Asian hate and violence that there's a long history to contend with in terms of the nuance of what Asian presence has meant across the hemisphere. And so often in these geometries, it's posited against indigeneity and against blackness. And we should ask in the service of who or of what. But what I would say is that following Zheng He and this question of colonization as one not of being one to come to the hemisphere, not one of settler colonialism, right? Or extractive colonialism, to take the natural resources of the continent to bring back to China, nor to settle and bring Chinese people to the continent. There are different modes of encounter and different modes of collecting. So it's really wonderful to think about collectives like Asianish. That was part of the programming for this exhibition, and to think about how presence is not a question of being told that you exist, but that these collectives have long existed, and that this exhibition is an opportunity to disrupt conventional curatorial logics that are ones of scarcity. And out of abundance, we're able to challenge conventional and colonial historiographies to really push back and say that we did not need discovering in the first place, but rather that we should ask why it is that these histories, these centuries-long histories have been written out of existence from art history for so long. So by this south by east orientation, we were able to decenter the West in critical ways. And I hope that this is just the beginning of that movement that takes to task, not just like the global North and the global South, or the West and the East as far as Orientalisms, but one through which we can really bring into conversation other hemispheres of relation. So yeah, it's really just an honor to be able to sit with the dialogue of conversation that Chie Jojima and Yuji Raphael have brought us together to discuss. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Tao. Maybe we can open to 1-2 questions, if that's okay.
Sure, Yes.
Okay, great. So, does anyone has any questions or comments?
Hello.
Yes, thank you. After seeing your own work, your kind of a multidisciplinary film, everything going on in your repertoire of work, how does that work now as an author of this collective of history and your kind of in-depth diaspora? How do you squeeze that in?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think there's a lot of squeezing in. And there are many different strategies, and I just find that artists are really doing this work in vital ways that is so visceral, that engages students to knowing about this history by looking at an artwork and really just understanding and encapsulating 500 years of history. So I just feel drawn to the strategies that artists deploy to really emotionally tell that story, whether it's about sugarcane plantations or, this process of forgetting. So more and more I find myself, as an educator, turning to art as a way to invite and draw students in, more than, say, a 200-page history book. The artwork becomes a way in to introduce and then to write that history. So I see my work as an artist and an author as in conversation, and an invitation to grapple with the so-called evidence. But I think the story basically decides what the medium is, and the question of the audience and who needs to hear that about that history. Thank you.
Does anyone has any other questions? Okay, maybe we can keep over a glass of something out there. So again, thank you very much, Tao. Thank you very much, Chie, Yuji. Thank you very much, Mariola, Howie, Colleen. Thank you, Asia Society.